Today we're going to talk about ecosystem thinking.
Yes, which I think a lot of people have been hanging out waiting for ever since we recorded the first 4 principles webinars a couple of years back. The 5th principle and the 6th principle, triple loop learning and ecosystems thinking, in XSCALE being an acronym, we didn't really have enough of a grasp on the material to be able to say concrete things about these things. So that's why we're getting our feet under us now with this. And some of what we're going to look at is still wet behind the ears. So part of the reason that we are doing this in a podcast now is to try and gather community feedback. So if you look at any of what we're doing and go, you guys are plumb loco, we probably are, and we would very much appreciate your input. Francis, do you think that's a fair summary of the state of the art?
Absolutely. We're going to get that material out, get some eyeballs on it early.
Sounds good. Okay, so Stefan, am I right in saying that you're not familiar with any of this material, very little of it?
Very little, I would say. So I'm as curious as all the other participants. So
cool. Well, then let's get into it. As per usual, we're going to do a bit of exposition up front, and then we're probably going to have rather more interactive stuff going on than in some of our previous webinar/podcasts, partly because, well, it's wet behind the ears, and partly because it would be more fun. I don't know if any of you know what you're looking at here, and anyone who's listening in a podcast mode won't be seeing it, so perhaps I should describe what these strange green circles mean. This is industrial agriculture, and what you see is a pattern of squares and circles, and it looks very higgledy-piggledy. And the reason for the circles is that in industrial agriculture we irrigate fields using these machines that use water pressure to go around in a circle and then drip water on the ground. It doesn't look very much like a natural construct. It looks very artificial. It looks like funny looking wallpaper. So the reason that I'm showing this picture is because I want to beg a question. And the question is, what's the difference between an ecosystem and any old system? Stefan, Francis, would you care to venture a guess? I have got it on the screen at the moment, but nevertheless, go ahead.
My take would be simple. An ecosystem is self-sustaining. You know, an ecosystem.
I like that. Yeah. Francis, would you go with that?
I think it's so an ecosystem is multiple systems that have relationships between them.
Yeah, I like both of those definitions. So I like to say that they're networks of mutual benefit, because I think that it sort of sums up both of those ideas. I gave an example at the Lean and Agile Systems Thinking Conference last week. But we only had a 5-minute lightning talk on this, and a story sprang to mind from, my wife comes from Minnesota, from farmland. And so there was a story that came from Minnesota about a farmer who had won the best ear of corn 20 years in a row. And at the local agricultural show, people were astonished that anyone would be able to win it 2 years in a row, much less 20 years in a row. And everyone was trying to find out, I'm going to call him Farmer Brown. I don't really know what his name was. Farmer Brown's secret. How on earth had he done this? Was there something special in the fertilizer? Did he have some weird voodoo plants from South America? What had he done? And people spied on him. People tried to wheedle it out of his family. No one was able to discover it. Finally, Farmer Brown retired, and the local reporter came around from the local newspaper and sat him down and said, "Look, Farmer Brown, we understand this is something that you've come up with yourself, and you don't have to share it with us, but it would be such a shame if you didn't. This is such a great boon to the community. If you could just tell us, how have you been winning the best ear of corn 20 years in a row?" And Farmer Brown said, no doubt with an accent I cannot possibly reproduce, he said, actually, I didn't even try to do it. I didn't set out to do this. Really, it was just that, my neighbors are very good neighbors, and I like to take care of them. And so when I won the first year, I went to them and I shared my best seeds with them. And the reporter was aghast and said, "You gave your best seeds to your neighbors?" And Farnborough said, "Yes, it was only the second year that I realized why it was such a good idea. You see, their plants pollinize my plants. So if they have the best corn, then all around me, then I will have the best corn." And that's what happened. So that idea of mutual benefit, we very seldom see that inside most of our client corporations. But that isn't to say it isn't a good idea. It's just that we haven't set up for it. And if you hark back to the Agile game theory podcast we had about a month ago, you'll see some ways to go about it. But in this podcast, we're going to think about things a bit differently. And to think about it differently, we're going to have to zoom in a little bit. So now we're looking at, we can see the circles still, and we can see these strange square things in between them. Those square things are cattle pens. So it's a fair question as to whether there's actual mutual benefit going on here. We can certainly see that the cattle are benefiting from the chaff and the leaves and so on that have been taken from the agricultural produce. But whether the cattle are producing the fertilizer, well, they're not producing the fertilizer for the crops. They couldn't produce so much fertilizer. That's part of the reason it's industrial agriculture. Most of the NPK fertilizer on the crops here is not coming from cattle, it's being mined. So the idea in an ecosystem is that the more different species that are generated, the more different relationships between those species, the more stable the ecosystem is with changing constraints. Well, with industrial agriculture, we know this isn't stable with changing constraints. We've seen dust bowls and droughts and floods wipe farmers out. And we've seen various kinds of pests wipe them out. We've seen some of the output of industrial agriculture generate non-sustainable outcomes. I'm thinking here of glyphosate. If anyone wants to take issue with that, I suggest you go and look up some of the studies that have just demonstrated that it is indeed a human carcinogen. But let's not go there. So if we look at industrial agriculture and ask ourselves, is this an ecosystem? Well, perhaps in the sense of Farmer Brown sharing seeds. But most of what we see seems to be organized hierarchically. And it's not just a two-level hierarchy. If we zoom in again, we can see that, well, in the middle of all of those large cattle pens, there is this nasty swamp of algae that's consuming the runoff from the pens. And it's probably the only organism that could, because the cattle naturally concentrate the pesticides and herbicides and the parts of fertilizers that aren't actually part of a natural cycle, and the antibiotics that they're injected with. So there's lots of substances coming out of those beasts, running into this central sump area, and, well, nothing else can eat it. So what we have here, it seems like a kind of an icky idea, what we're looking at. I mean, it can't smell too good. Algae itself can be farmed, and there are ways forward ecologically for humans that involve algae culture, but that's a different story. Here, what we're looking at reminds me more of a study that Credit Suisse did in 2011 of the ownership relationships between banks and corporations of all sorts, the large corporations. They studied 35 million corporations all around the world, publicly traded corporations, and they graphed the ownership relationships between these corporations. And they discovered a couple of remarkable things. One of the things they discovered was that all of the 35 million, well, almost all, were majority owned by a clique of just 14,000. It was less than 0.05%, something like that, of the 35 million, owned all of the rest. And so it's a little bit like the cattle yards consuming all the most of the biomass from the fields. Obviously, some of the biomass goes off to humans in the form of food crops, but quite a lot of it is only consumable by animals that are able to digest cellulose, which is to say cattle. But there was another disturbing thing about the Credit Suisse study in 2011. They found that that group of 14,000 was controlled by a cabal of 147 companies. That group of 147 controlled at least a 40% share in each of the 14,000. And the cabal, those companies all mutually owned each other. Now, I'm not big on conspiracy theories. I think this is just a natural way that human systems tend to work when they're not regulated to eliminate the tragedy of the commons. And again, if you are interested in that kind of tragedy, you should look up our Agile game theory podcast from a month ago. So that central cabal, that's the banks and the big farmers and big media, and all of the usual suspects. There's no surprises about the company names in that group of 147. There might be surprises if we could look at the board membership. But it's a little bit like this nasty patch of algae in the middle. They're not really producing anything of value for the rest of the ecosystem. They're simply sitting there and consuming. So if we were able to farm the algae, well, we might do considerably better than a lot of our food crops. Algae can more than double its biomass in just 24 hours. But again, that's a different story. So in an ecosystem, the more different relationships that are supplied, the more productive the ecosystem is over time. And you can think of the Amazon as perhaps the zenith of this, or perhaps some of the world's oceans before we set up industrial fisheries. The point, though, is if we don't have too many relationships, then we're quite wobbly. So when we think about business ecosystems, things like Apple's ecosystem of all of the billion applications in the world, or Facebook's, or Google's, or Amazon's, and you might think, well, Amazon's one way like this, but it's not. Only its retail operation, and even there, it's connecting many small suppliers with many small consumers. So it's actually a very rich ecosystem. But when you consider their cloud APIs and so on, it's richer still. And of course, that's where they make most of their money. So most of all, when you have this kind of concentration of control, then it's very easy for catastrophes to occur. And we can think of this central swamp as a catastrophe in that, well, pretty obviously, that road around it, that round road, it was originally straight. This thing is growing. And this is a symptom of the unsustainability of agriculture, industrial agriculture all over the world. Are you guys with me so far?
Absolutely.
Yep. Yes.
Cool. All right, so I will go on. I promise I'll get to the interactive part soon. All right, how can we think about designing healthy ecosystems? There is a game that was invented 4,000 years ago in China by a fellow named the Duke of Wen. The Chinese call it Wei Qi. It's better known in the West by its Japanese name, which is just Go, G-O. And this is the most complex game that humans play. It's played on a 19 by 19 board where any move is legal at any time. And while the rules themselves are very, very simple, incredibly simple, not much more complex than noughts and crosses, tic-tac-toe, because of the fact that each stone that's played influences the value of all of the other stones, they basically co-evolve the structures on a Go board. coming to grips with this is much more strategically difficult than chess, where you only have to think about an 8x8 board and there's only a few legal moves. So when you play Go, there is a fundamental strategy that you need to master to be able to win. I'm not proposing to teach anyone Go in the next 30 seconds. But the basic idea is that, well, black and white take turns placing stones at the intersections of the board. They never move the stones. They just take turns, one white stone, then one black stone, and so on. And the way to look at the board in a biological metaphor, you can imagine there is an oxygen source available for every intersection of horizontal and vertical lines, where this is where you play the stones. And that oxygen supply is almost, but not quite enough to keep one stone alive there. So as long as you understand that stones of the same color that are connected by horizontal or vertical lines can share that oxygen supply, then the fact that a group of stones might only have a few connections to the outside world where they can get enough oxygen to keep all of their stones alive, that isn't much of a problem. But if they get completely surrounded by stones of the other color, then effectively they strangle. So the biological metaphors with this game are very strong. And what's really interesting about it is that as we go along playing Go, as there are more and more stones on the table, on the board, we get more and more sharper and sharper constraints. So when you play, this one rule that you must use to be able to not lose at Go, doesn't guarantee you're going to win by any stretch of the imagination. This rule is called whole board thinking. And the idea is, rather than trying to respond directly to the other player's last move, you want to start by broadening your focus to look at the entire board. And since there are many fights going on a Go board at once, and there are also many bits that are basically empty, they're unplumbed potential, you have to evaluate which of these parts of the board holds the greatest potential for development. And once you've decided which part of the board that is, then you look at what are the strategic forces coming from the other parts of the board, and you start to then narrow your focus as you understand which of those strategic forces are important, which aren't. And then finally, you can think tactically. You can get down to the chess level. And then, so you play one stone, and the other player plays one stone. You have to pop your focus back out to the whole board again. If you don't engage in that discipline of always going out to the whole board, if you just respond to the other player's stone, then you will invariably lose. The other player will lead you around by the nose. So this short-term thinking is unfortunately extremely common in product management, and it's very common in the way that people go about transformations as well. We think about symptoms, we don't think about root causes. We think about individuals, we don't think about the network of trust binding them together. And again, I'll refer back to that Agile game theory podcast for examples of how to quantify these things. The old hippie maxim of think globally, act locally, that's what this whole board thinking principle is about. But it's only one principle that's important to the health of an ecosystem. And so what we're going to look at in about 5 minutes is a whole set of these principles that derive from the work of two Australian environmentalists, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. Mollison passed away in 2016. Holmgren is very much alive and kicking and has been kind enough to give us some feedback on the ecosystems thinking ideas we're going to review here already. So I'm hoping we're going to get considerably more, because there's a very active global learning ecosystem based in the permaculture principles. And what we're doing in trying to adapt them to corporate organizations is basically heresy from the point of view of that ecosystem, because they're really not very interested in big corporate. They're very interested in small holding farms, in very humane, green change ways of living. So it's been enormously generous of them to extend their thinking to endeavors that might not be biologically, ecologically sustainable. Nevertheless, I think they think that there's mutual benefit to be had there too, and that by exploiting it, we can actually do things that can make the entire ecosystem, the technological, the economical, and the ecological, to make the whole thing into something that's sustainable. Now, I know that's woolly-minded, utopian thinking. Nevertheless, it's a good intent to have, because otherwise we'll strangle on our own wastes. So for now, I guess I'm asking the listeners to suspend their disbelief as we dive into this stuff, partly because even if you have a purely financial interest in improving your organization, well, there's an enormous amount of value in permaculture, and hopefully we're able to maintain that in its adaptation to agile organizations. All right. One more bit of exposition and we'll dive in, guys. So first bit of exposition has to do with trying to make this less about farming. I want to look at the design of an ecosystem. This is an example taken from our XPM course, to do with the design of iPhone, not iPhone the device, iPhone the ecosystem. We want to understand markets as ecosystems. And the first problem we've got is that the devices, they kind of distract us. There is a structure to markets. When we talked about Pirate Canvas, we started to look at that structure. Markets are not flat. The Kano diagram, I don't know if we've touched on Kano or not. I think we have when we were looking at the product management practice patterns in XSCALE. It's not flat and it's not static. So it's a moving, highly dimensional surface. In the diagram we're looking at here, it looks three-dimensional. If we imagine that the z-axis or z-axis, depending on where you come from, is satisfaction or market impact, well, the x and y-axis are vast numbers of design dimensions all squished into a plane. So what we'd like to do with this is, let's take the devices out of the picture. If we're going to describe how to design an ecosystem, we're going to have to do that. We have to understand ecosystems in terms of networks of mutual benefit. So if we're just thinking about how to improve an existing device, if we're focusing on user experience design or design thinking that focuses on solving an individual problem, we're going to wind up in a bad place. I think, I don't know if we did use the example, I'll use it again. Design thinking has been applied to ecological problems with a very checkered history. And the best example, I think, was the village in Africa, where when the design thinking people turned up, they went, aha, the biggest problem here is that there's a very high incidence of malaria. So they did all of the design thinking stuff about getting feedback from the customers, again, the customer's point of view properly represented, and prototyping and test, all the stuff that goes into design thinking. And they decided, okay, the best solution, we believe, having trialed it, is DDT is a cheap pesticide. It's not necessarily very good for the environment, but it's not very good for humans. But it's cheap enough for us to use here, and it's certainly much better than allowing the malaria to go on. So they were able to buy some of this stuff and spray all of the herbage around the village, and it got rid of the pests, sure enough. And then, when the rainy season arrived, all of the huts all over the village, every single one, lost its roof. All the roofs collapsed because it turned out that there was a beetle whose larvae ate a fungus, and the fungus was the fungus that affected thatched roofs. So without thinking breadth first about ecosystems, we can often create far worse problems than we are solving. But I said I was going to get away from the biological and get to technological and the design of iPhone. So most people, when they think of the design of iPhone, think about this lovely experience of touching the glass multi-touch screen and having it respond to you. That's not where it started. It started with a decision by Steve Jobs to take all of the Apple product lines out of the big box stores, out of CompUSA and the malls. They were in 11,000 CompUSA stores. They did some mystery shopping. They discovered that the sales staff in CompUSA were inducing customers to compare Apple devices with cheap Chinese MP3 players. They knew that if that happened with phones, given that iPhone was going to be the most expensive phone on the planet, that they the market impact they needed. So you might think, oh, well, that's just a business decision. It's a bit of a marketing decision. That's got nothing to do with design. Well, they had to build bricks and mortar stores, and they built them as machines. The Apple retail stores are the most expensive retail real estate on the planet. And they are full of monitoring devices to make certain that at that precise moment, just when you have picked something off the shelf and you've gone, no, I actually think this is probably the right thing to buy, that is when the Apple genius materializes out of thin air and says, well, sir or madam, would you like some help with that? So the engineering that went into the Apple stores is astonishing. All of the backroom systems as well, it's all automated. So, and then the scripts and all of the retail supply chains, all of the billing, it was an enormous engineering project. And it began with broad strokes ecosystem design. So it's an acquisition play. You're trying to acquire customers. So take the product out of the big box stores. Then we have another part of iPhone's design that most people don't even think of as iPhone. And this was a strange little device. It was a cable. It was a little white cable that allowed you to suck your entire iTunes library down into your phone in one fell slurp. And the amazing thing about this was it also charged the phone. It was actually absolutely indispensable. It was amazing that you could get that much bandwidth, that much information squirted from one device to another down this tiny little cable. Before that, all of the cables were ribbon cables, and they were very unwieldy things, and that it would take you quite a long time to transfer your data. So why did they do that? Why did they focus that much design and engineering effort on a little white cable? Well, it was because it was part of their activation strategy. It wasn't just the cable, but the cable meant that the moment that you plugged your phone in, you would be able to get your credit card number bound to the IMEI number, the SIM card number in the phone. And that meant that your phone could bill you for things without going through a telco. Now, at the time, every telco on the planet had conditions in their contract that meant that any equipment manufacturers would have to bill via the telco's phone bill. And that meant that the telcos were able to suck up 95% of the value that was paid by the customers for the software or the content. Apple had to give enormous sweetheart deals to a telco in every market. AT&T is the one most people recall. So they'd be willing to do that. And again, that was all about this activation play. It was about how do we have a seamless experience of turning our customers who are presently buying songs for pennies into our customers who are buying devices for hundreds of dollars at a stroke, multiplying the value of our ecosystem by a factor of 10,000. It was clever. So then we've got the obvious, the screen. Now, most people will go, oh, well, that was a retention play. It was all about making certain that the customers will keep and will never go back to the BlackBerry phones. It was a retention play, but it wasn't about that. It was about making certain that people's children would drag them into the Apple stores over and over and over again to play Flappy Birds or Angry Birds or whatever kind of birds. They were getting people to enter and re-enter and re-enter the Apple ecosystem. That's retention. So yes, it did indeed work to also retain the customers who tried the phone out, because after you'd had the experience, you'd go, oh, that was an awful lot nicer. But the main thing was it kept people coming into the stores. They became little mini amusement parks. It was like a little fair, a little circus. There was a referral play to do with iMessage, and which was the free SMS, but only for iOS users, and Find My Friends. Both of those were incentives for parents to go, you know, if I was to buy an iPhone for little Johnny or little Jill, I would always know where they are. And I wouldn't have to pay these astronomical SMS bills anymore. The phone would pay for itself in the first year. It's effectively free. So it was a very big Christmas for Apple that year. And finally, there was this thing called the App Store. It obsoleted an entire industry without anyone worrying about it too much. But the whole point of that was not return in the sense of making Apple a lot of money. I did make them a lot of money, but compared to the amount of money they were spending on the phones, it was a pittance. The people were spending on the phones. The phones were very expensive and the apps were not. And they only got 30% of the value of the apps. But the return for them was developer mindshare. That was why they were so generous on terms. The developers had been used to the idea that if they wanted to sell their software, it would go onto a shelf in a retail store, and the people who boxed it up and the people who put it on the shelf would have to get their bit, and if they were lucky, the developers would get 30% of the retail value of the software. All of a sudden, they could get 70% of it, turn the equation on its head. And so that's why there were a billion apps for the App Store so rapidly. And that's how they were able to suck in so many people so rapid. That's why it went off faster than any other product in the history of the universe. So, except possibly Domino's Pizza, but that's a different story. So that's all lovely. It gives us an idea that ecosystem design has to precede experience design. But I want to get back to permaculture. Now, we are looking at a diagram of a permaculture farm. And if you recall the industrial agriculture diagram we were looking at before, this doesn't look anything like that. You can see all these beautiful curves and swoops. The farm is optimizing yield according to the different kinds of soil and wind and moisture conditions in different parts of the terrain. It's designed to maximize yield for a small holding. It's quite human intensive, but that's all right because it more than supports the humans who live on it. And again, this is not like industrial agriculture. The basic model for permaculture is what Mollison, I think, I never know which one of them said which, called a food forest. Imagine a rainforest. Rainforests are these incredibly lush environments, but imagine it with a selection of trees and plants and animals, all of whom produce eggs and vegetables and fruits that humans can eat. That's a food forest. It doesn't necessarily produce saleable yield in the same way because, well, not everything is going to ripen the same way. You've got different conditions in different spots. But it means that if you are careful about synchronizing your preservation of the goods, and if you're careful about how you establish cycles of mutual benefit between the organisms, you can do an awful lot better than industrial agriculture. So we've talked about one of the permaculture principles. And so I think this is where I'd like to rope Francis into the conversation. You're still there, I hope.
So, yes, I'm still here.
Excellent. Okay, so I should explain immediately, Francis and I have been taking these permaculture principles and trying to generalize them to agile organizations, which is to say, you might want to mute for now, Francis, and come back, or use headphones, because we're getting echoes. So what I'm intending, though, is that we'll start by looking at the permaculture principle, and then we'll look at the generalization, or it might not be a generalization, it might be a specialization to the corporate world, to large financially oriented organizations, and see whether we're being fair or not. Now, Stefan, if you would also interact with the folk we've got on the line who might be able to ask questions, and if you could ask questions yourself, we're going to have 12 of these principles, and maybe we can also look at the questions on a per principle basis.
Well, if you have any questions, please let us know. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your window where you can post questions.
Cool beans. All right, so the permaculture principle, the very first one: observe and interact. By taking time to engage with nature, we can design solutions that suit our particular situation. The first time we saw this, Francis and I immediately recognized this is very similar to the lean ideas about Genchi Genbutsu, Kaizen, all of that stuff. You need to actually go to the workplace and observe what's going on. It's also very similar to the Agile principle. Here's the 9th one from the manifesto, that face-to-face communication is the most effective way for information to pass into and between members of a team. So we thought this could be, if it was specialized to Agile organizations, observe and interact. Business, design, and technical stakeholders must work together as peers, face-to-face, to design solutions that fit each other's constraints. Francis, what do you think?
I think the key part that we wanted to take was that nature in an organization has a different reference to the permaculture nature, and the mapping into the different stakeholders is they're all the different touch points that people in the organization deal with. So we're very clear that the principles we're working on are for the people in the organization, because organizations are made out of people, and Agile organizations acknowledge that.
Yeah, very well said, man. The beauty of this is that, well, nature is a set of organisms that are interacting, and an organization is a set of people that are interacting. So I think it's a very natural way to put it. Any questions so far, Stefan?
Nope, not on my side.
All good. Then let's go on to the second one of these. So the permaculture principle: catch and store energy. By developing systems that collect resources at peak abundance, we can use them in times of need. So this goes to, well, things as simple as batteries to collect solar energy or other means of energy storage, but it also goes to very fundamental biological resources. We have various different organisms yielding useful resources, and if we preserve them, then we get to use them later on. This is kind of the fundamental of agriculture as opposed to hunting and collecting. Well, in generalizing this to human organizations, we realized originally we were thinking about money as energy. We went, no, money's just an information system. What really generates the ability to break through constraints is learning. So capture and store learning in small, autonomous, cross-functional teams. As these teams satisfy current constraints, they become capable of breaking through future bottlenecks. Now, you might immediately think, well, wait a second, we have knowledge bases, we write things down. That's how we store our learning. But you would then have to activate that learning by getting people to read this stuff. In your small, autonomous, cross-functional team, you have an immediate living embodiment of the learning, and it's enormously valuable to your organization. It's a tremendous accelerator on its ability to cope with external change. And the starvation that happens naturally when one or another value stream begins to tap out. Francis, what do you think?
So one thing that we worked hard to capture was the now and the then-ness of that principle. And when you translate energy from into human organizations, the now and the then is really about capability and capacity. And really, we wanted to really make sure that organizations were focused on losing that old school practice of continuously breaking and reforming teams at the whim of the organization. it's okay if the teams break and reform, because they will carry their learnings with them as they carry their relationships from team to team. And as we can carry those forward, then those relationships stand the organisation in good stead and take those learnings into the future.
So this goes to product management instead of project management, and stream funding instead of budgets. So yes, it's a very powerful principle to apply in an agile organization. But I think there's something else to it, and it has to do with this idea of future bottlenecks. We often have very short-term thinking that underpins the breaking apart and then rehiring of individual resources. And software developers think of it as a sausage factory where the organization treats them as replaceable, interchangeable, not recognizing that their learning about technical constraints is every bit as valuable as the business stakeholders learning about business constraints, or the designers learning about design constraints. Stefan, any questions?
Not so far.
Okie dokie. Do feel free to ask them yourself.
Yeah, I just I'm not shy.
I haven't noticed you being shy. Okay, so next one. I love this one. Obtain a yield. Ensure that you are getting truly useful rewards as part of the work that you're doing. So the idea here is that it doesn't do you very much good to be building a beautiful food forest in your small holding farm if you're not able to find a way to sustain yourself in doing so. You have various needs to interact with the rest of the human world, and you better make certain that you're getting useful rewards as part of the work you're doing, not just planning for the future. This goes to Agile's idea about maximizing return on investment by getting your features to market early and often, rather than building up a lot of wasteful inventory of software features or components that you can't bring to market yet. You want to continuously integrate, continuously deliver, continuously deploy. So, obtain a yield. Teams must measure and optimize their contribution to top-line business throughput as a result of the work they're doing. Now, this is where we were talking about throughput accounting last time. We have a bit of agile heresy, because the whole agile world is very focused on the idea of velocity. We're trying to do what I said before. We're trying to deliver and deploy this stuff. If we don't focus on the benefit, the outcomes, if we're not using feedback from those outcomes to guide our prioritization, if instead we go, we've got whoever these very powerful product managers or hippos in the room, if those are the highest paid person's opinion hippo, if that's what dominates our decision making and our prioritization, well, then we're not going to maximize the benefit that is paying for us being here. So in other words, we're not obtaining a yield because we're not even sharing the information about the product analytics and the company's financials. So this is where the open book management stuff that we talked about the last two times is vitally important. Francis?
You know, there's a really sneaky point in here. So to contribute to top-line business throughput, the team needs to be cross-functional. I think
you may be suffering from bad bandwidth, mate. Stefan, are you getting Francis or not?
No. Francis, you're breaking off.
Yeah, we can't hear you. It's very melodic, though.
Yeah.
It sounds quite a lot like Forbidden Planet.
Francis, to integrate.
Francis, can you hear us? Hello? Oh, let's see. Hang on. If we look at the chat. Maybe I can type the answer here. So Francis can hear us. All right. By all means, type I think if you've got your video on, you might want to turn it off, but if it's not on, then life's like that. Okay, so the cross-functional team can interpret and add value to top line and that's all it says. Okay, I think, oh, hang on, to top line, a non-cross-functional team will be limited in its contribution. Ah, excellent point. Non-cross-functional teams, component teams, they don't have the skills to be able to collectively put out features to be able to contribute to top-line throughput. I think that that also goes to the structure of value streams and portfolios. Now, I'm going to assume that Francis will get his bandwidth situation under control, maybe by tethering through his phone, with a bit of luck. Cross-func teams are autonomous. Storm too big. Ah, we do have a nasty thunderstorm racing through Sydney at the moment. Francis is in the southern suburbs. So let's just keep our fingers crossed that after the next bit of me waxing lyrical, we'll have him back. So, any questions?
Yeah. There's a question from Mel. If there was only one thing I could change, this would be the one. I'm not sure that whether this is a statement or a question. Mel, could you elaborate on this a bit? Are you looking for the one thing to change, probably?
I'm curious about that too. Well, look, we only have a few people on. Stefan, would you like to add Mel to the panel? She's, as I understand it, Mel's got a fair amount of permaculture experience and Agile as well. It's a statement. Why even do projects or change if you're not focused on the business outcome? Exactly.
Mel, you can talk.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can indeed. Go ahead.
Cool. Yeah. Really, if there was only one thing that I could change, this would be it. Most projects start with, we want to implement System X. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, that's a good question. I wonder why we didn't ask why before. So what you're saying is you agree with the principle, but you don't see it in your clients.
Exactly, yeah. Most projects start with, we want to implement System X, and they only take responsibility up to, we've implemented System X. Mm-hmm. To me, that's not the start or the end. It should be about, well, what is the thing that you want to be able to do that you can't do now?
Yes. What's the business capability, or what is the market impact? I completely agree. That's why I love this principle so much, because it just seems, when I first saw the permaculture version, it was blindingly obvious to me that we had to do this, that we have to be able to bring this into the corporate world, because so much of the crappy impact that corporations have on the ecosphere is caused by this kind of incredibly short-term thinking, where we've decided we want to build a mine next to a reef. We've decided we want to have a gas pipeline going through a river. All of the nonsense that causes enormous environmental impacts is because of the fact that we are measuring things without considering their proper yield. And while, okay, maybe some religion somewhere is right and we're all about to be called into heaven where no doubt it rains every day and you've got as much water as you could possibly use, well, that also might not happen for an awfully long time. We've got to kind of make it here. So, okay with me going on?
Yes. Please.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I don't mind saying, yes, I'm being a bit utopian in statements like that, but really what we're doing with Agile has a utopian flavor to it as well. And the reason that that's fair is that it has an enormous benefit to the businesses we're working with. So a utopian mindset isn't so bad. And we'll see that in the 12th principle when we get to it. Okay. Apply self-regulation and accept feedback. We need to discourage inappropriate activity to ensure that systems can continue to function well. And in a permaculture context, as I understand it, inappropriate activity is activity where either we are consuming non-renewable resources or we're producing resources that are not being consumed. There's this lovely example in one of the permaculture books. It was something Mollison said to Holmgren about a farm that was afflicted with a lot of snails. And Holmgren said to Mollison, well, okay, here you go, because Mollison was the elder of the two, and as I understand it, there was a certain apprentice period, but I might be getting that wrong. Anyway, Mollison stood there looking at the snails. Holmgren said, what do we do about this except break out the pesticides? And Mollison said, the problem here is not too many snails. The problem is too few ducks. Because, of course, ducks eat snails and they turn them into duck eggs, which you can eat. So the idea of closing the loops to be able to maximize productivity comes at this idea of appropriate versus inappropriate. And that's true inside the organizations we work with as well. The systems can continue to function well. Well, let's try generalizing it. So align teams into self-managing value streams that continuously adapt their work priorities to changing market feedback. Maybe we're more specializing than generalizing. Francis, are you there? Yes, something. I see something in the chat. Yep, it says. Try turning on your microphone, might work this time. He says, very important to note.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Excellent. Go ahead.
A bit unstable. So it's really important that we don't hide the negative feedback from the teams. So you can't self-regulate when you only get positive news. Oh, you're doing great, you're doing great, you're doing great. You don't know where to improve. And so negative feedback is just as valuable as the positive feedback.
Mm-hmm. Even more so. This goes to Mel's point as well, that why are we delivering these systems? Well, we might have had a good reason to begin with, but without the negative feedback, we might not have a good reason anymore. And there we are wasting money doing it.
Yes, it's very easy for projects to continue to obsolescence.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So once again, we've got that concept that the team maybe isn't as autonomous as we think it is. All we've got is like free spinning wheels. We don't really have cars that drive themselves.
Yes. So that's the self-managing. There's an aspect of self-reliance in the discussion of the original permaculture principle that we sort of, one of the things we're trying to do with this is keep the principles nice and short. And so if we had said self-directing portfolios of self-managing streams of self-organizing teams, I didn't feel that was really going to be adding much value to the way the principle reads. But what we're going to have to do with all of these is produce a bunch of nice illustrations that'll make the full breadth of the principle's application clear. Now, shall we move on?
Yes, please.
Take that for a yes. Okay. All right, next. So, use and value renewable resources and services. Make the best use of nature's abundance to reduce our consumptive behavior and dependence on non-renewable resources. This takes us into ideas about self-sufficiency for these smallholding farms. Some of them, after many years, may even get to the point where they're completely off the grid. They're only using the resources on the farm itself. But of course, for most people who like permaculture, they're still dependent on the support of the rest of society. Once upon a time, the rest of society wasn't able to provide that support. And one of the premises in permaculture is that society will eventually run out of fossil fuels to keep it going in its current mode. This is an idea called energy descent. And then everybody's going to have to leave the cities and go back on the land. That was in the 70s, people. Where there were a lot of sort of doom and gloom sayers. And I'm not certain that Holmgren would be particularly hung up on the idea that that's not necessarily going to happen. In fact, I don't think he is anymore. I think he's more of the mind that the wastes that we are producing and the consumptive behavior that we are using with our non-renewable resources, that's still something that can kill us. It's just that it isn't necessarily only fossil fuels. If you look at NPK fertilizer and a bunch of mineral ores, that point's just as good as it was before. Happily, I mentioned before that we have technologies to do with algae culture that might be able to solve part of the problem. We're able to engineer edible algae that has just about exactly the right profile of amino acids and protein and so on, and fats and you name it, that humans could live on. It doesn't necessarily taste like anything other than, well, green stuff, although apparently some of it tastes good. But over the next decade or two, we will probably be able to engineer that into a replacement for agriculture. We can also use 3D printing for our, not just the stuff in our houses, but the houses themselves. We already have 3D printers for houses. We can use augmented reality so that we can meet without having to visit each other in cafes in cities. We have plenty of renewable energy resources coming up. And if we're able to replace agriculture with algae culture, we'll have no end of living space and human population is stabilizing. If it wasn't for the fact that we're heading for apparently a climate catastrophe, well, we'd be looking pretty cute. The energy descent thing is not important to the value of permaculture. You don't have to buy off on the premise to see that the principles have general application to efficiently, effectively, and rapidly developing healthy ecosystems, whether biological or business. So I think the conversation about the premise, that's a really interesting conversation, but not one we'll go into right now. Let's look at the specialization of this. Share resources and services across value streams as much as possible. Motivate mutual benefit for teams and streams to reduce silos, dependencies, and missed opportunities. Well, this goes to a lot of the game theoretic stuff we were doing in our last podcast, or the one before. It goes to open book management. It has to do as well with the communication structures and leadership protocols that we've talked about over the last little while. We talked about chapters and councils, representative councils, the Iroquois stuff. All of that goes to motivating mutual benefit. But the key here is we want the benefit that we are gathering to be measured in terms of actual top-line business throughput. And we want the rewards to be hooked up to it. That's how we're able to motivate mutual benefit. If everybody's working to individual KPIs and OKRs that aren't hooked up to movement of the top line, then we don't get the kind of growth that we have in something like Springfield Remanufacturing Corporation we looked at last time, where they grew 234,000% in 25 years. I thought that this was also something that goes to, because it's about sharing, goes to the ideas of open source, open content. Maybe not so open that you're sharing with the outside world, but within the organization, open book management is about sharing the information, the top line information that people need to be able to make well-informed decisions and to motivate them to make decisions that are good for each other rather than just good for one or the other. Francis,
I've been thinking a lot about this one, and I think this is the sharing economy gone full circle. So we started off with open source, and then we had the external manifestation, the Ubers, and everybody saying, we'll get everybody else to do our work, and then we'll take a skim over the top of that. And this really pulls it back inside the organization. If we break down our silos and we share our information, other people will generate value out of our information. And so then they have incentive in many directions to share those OKRs and other resources. So we consume less externally and we can produce more within the groups and within our own personal set of interactions.
That collective ownership principle that was in XP to begin with, and which we have in the XSCALE manifesto, was not unfortunately included in the original Agile manifesto, goes to that as well.
Yeah, it just brings it back in, because that we see in many teams they've lost that bit.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it goes to decentralized version control and all of the sharing of tests as well, and for that matter, the sharing of data. Really, what we'd like to see is that anyone who needs to be able to touch some part of the resources or services of some value stream, that they're able to do so with a minimum of fuss, while still maintaining alignment with the needs of the other streams.
Absolutely. Anything in the organization. So open book accounting is also related to this bit.
Yeah. Cool. So any questions? Shall we go on?
Let's go on. We already exceeded the time frame. So
okay. I figured since we're asking questions as we go, it won't be too bad. Unless, Stefan, you're going to have to head out early.
Go on.
Okay. All right. I'll try to go faster though. Produce no waste. By valuing and making use of all the resources that are available to us, nothing goes to waste. So this is more than waste in the lean sense. This is also waste in the sense of pollution. Mercilessly refactor value streams, reuse, recycle, or reduce all the outputs their teams produce until nothing goes to waste. This merciless refactoring idea came from extreme programming. It was about making certain we didn't have duplication and pathological dependencies and things that were not self-documenting in our code base. There's no reason that doesn't generalize perfectly to value streams as a whole. The fact that refactoring is something that is regarded as geeky because the word itself has a lot of syllables is just sad. What refactoring is really about is simplifying by reusing, recycling, or reducing outputs until every output is being used. So for example, there are a bunch of Swedish factories where the exhaust gases of the factory in the wintertime are piped through living spaces to warm the living spaces. So you don't get more wasteful than waste heat. They've found ways to reuse it. And if we think about the reduction end of this, it might not seem economical to do. But the more waste, the more we're producing a rod for our own back. That was as true in software as it is for physical resources of value streams. Francis, have a go.
Yeah, I've seen many Agile teams and I've been to many conferences where they talk about how awesome they are and all the wonderful, funky stuff they've shipped and how they did do some technical debt reduction, but really they reconsidered their business cases and looked to refactor all the things that they produce. So their test results could go into log systems and their log systems could feed back into their other systems. And it's really hard. The Agile principle that was there has been so watered down in its interpretation that I heard an Agile trainer the other day say that it's really about designing them better so that there's less waste when you start the work.
Well, this also goes to, like, say, 4.5's definition of refactoring as something that must be planned and estimated and prioritized along with other work. No, merciless refactoring. You have to pay down your technical debt continuously.
And that's why I said, we have to be explicit that we want that refactor word here, because it was just getting lost in the message. There's so many flavors of the Agile thing, and we know that intention has been lost.
Yes, beautiful. Okay, Stefan, shall we go on?
Depends on how long that would take. We're beyond.
Okay, how long do you have? Because what we could do is do a part 2.
Yeah, I think that sounds more appropriate, because otherwise
All right.
we need to rush.
So then what we should probably do with this, we'll wrap up here, but I should also mention that the first 6 permaculture principles, and for that matter, the first 6 ecosystems thinking principles, are really kind of the micro level principles about individuals and teams. The second 6 are the macro ones about portfolios and organizations. So next time, we are going to dig deep on this, and hopefully, Mel, you'll be able to come along as well.
So do.
Fantastic. We'll invite you. All right, folks. Stefan, do you want to wrap us up?
Well, gentlemen, thanks a lot for the interesting idea of aligning biological systems with our métier of doing business. I find this very interesting, and I'm looking forward to continue this.
Fantastic.
Will you make a suggestion? Probably next Friday.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Let's do it.
All right. Mel, you're on too?
Yep.
Beautiful.
Awesome.
Okay, folks. Well, I guess that wraps it up for another XSCALE podcast. Thank you all.
Likewise. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, Stefan. Francis. No, bye.